All right, another big thing that happened during this time period was the Crusades, and we've all heard about the Crusades, but let's talk a little bit about sort of the prehistory or the backdrop to the Crusades, and that is the Great Schism, the Great Eastern Schism, that is. So in 1054, the one church, the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, Catholic with a lower C because it wasn't Roman Catholic yet. It was just one church. Tracing back to Christ, right? Um, but the one church split in 1054. Remember that there was the Roman Empire had been divided, and so there was an eastern headquarters in Constantinople, and then the west in Rome. And over time, there were a number of issues that caused them to argue and ultimately to divide into two churches, which then became the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. One of those issues was the marriage of priests. Remember that priests had married in the church historically and had families, or many priests had married and had families, but that the West felt that perhaps it would be better for priests not to marry, to remain celibate and have a singular focus. And so that was one issue. Another issue, which seems kind of maybe small to us, is whether to use leavened or unleavened bread in Holy Communion. Leavened bread, of course, is regular bread that rises with yeast. Unleavened bread is like a matzah, it's flat. And it's actually what Roman Catholics use, that wafer that is not that's just completely flat and doesn't have yeast in it to make it rise. And they argued about which type to use in Holy Communion. A larger issue, well, not even a larger issue, this issue was also arguably pretty silly, and that is in the Nicene Creed, there's a clause that the West added later called the Filioque Clause. And actually, I'll mention that a little bit later, but I'm not going to bring it up right here. Another issue was papal supremacy. That is, nobody argued that the Patriarch of Rome had a very special standing because he occupied the Holy See of St. Peter, but they started to debate about what that meant and what kind of supremacy that patriarch had over the other patriarchs, and that culminated also into a big fight. And then finally, the Pope and the Eastern Patriarch ended up excommunicating each other, and it all was downhill from there. So we ended up with, unfortunately, two separate churches. So that is just sort of a little bit of a backdrop, although I didn't go into much detail there. Number one and foremost was to regain control of Jerusalem, which had been overrun by Muslims, taken over by Muslims. Islam had already risen centuries before and had gotten control of the Holy Land. But another goal for the Pope was to reunite the church. He was hoping that through the Crusades, all the Christians could come together, fight for the Holy Land, and come back together. So there were a number of reasons that would make a knight desire to go fight in the Crusades. One of them was that the Pope had indicated that if you fought in the Crusades and died, you would basically have the death of a martyr, and it was you had sort of a direct path to heaven. Another, of course, is young knights wanting to fight just for the adventure and because they get to wear the cool armor and fight with cool weapons. Also, the word is called primogeniture, which means the eldest son inherits everything. Another goal for kings was that sometimes they had troublesome knights that they kind of were hoping would get killed, so they would send them out. I mean, it's not funny, but it's funny. So they would send them out off into the Crusades and hope that they would not come back. So in 1093, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius asked the Pope and the West for help fighting the Seljuk Turks, who were Muslim, and Pope Urban II issues a call for a crusade or a holy war. 96, and the Pope promises crusaders who die in fighting a place in heaven. Three armies gather together at Constantinople in 1097. They capture lands along the coast divided into four crusader states, and they were very poorly organized, but they did capture Jerusalem and some of the Holy Land in 1099, and Muslims, unfortunately for the Christians, later won some of this back, and they spent the other crusades trying to win it back. The Second Crusade was clearly a loss. Crusaders lost to a great Muslim leader named Saladin in 1187. He was a Muslim leader and a Kurdish warrior, and he was able to retake Jerusalem for the Muslims. The Third Crusade was interesting because there were three powerful European rulers who went out and led the Crusades. You had Richard I of England, who was called the Lionhearted, Richard the Lionhearted, Philip II of France, Philip Augustus, and then Frederick I, or Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, who we learned about in the last chapter. So Richard the Lionhearted, King of England, was sort of where they got these sort of Robin Hood stories. He was returning from the Third Crusade. Basically, what happens is Philip goes out, Philip II of France. He gets into an argument with Richard the Lionhearted over the fact that Richard broke off with Philip's sister, broke off an engagement with her, so Philip was not very happy. But Frederick I of Germany, who was the leader of the Holy Roman Empire at the time, drowned during the journey. And so here's a depiction of him drowning. So in 1192, Richard and Saladin make peace after many battles. And Saladin keeps Jerusalem, but allows Christian pilgrims to enter the city, which was somewhat of a compromise. And after this point, the crusading spirit kind of dwindles, and the later crusades are just complete failures. So the Fourth Crusade is an utter disaster. In 1204, Crusaders loot Constantinople, and this is not a good thing because, number one, Constantinople is Christian, so they were Christian brothers who were invading Christian brothers. So you had Western Roman Catholic knights who were looting their Orthodox brothers, and that pushed the churches further apart, so that just increased the split. So they attacked the Christian city of Zara, and anyway, this was a big problem. They are the Pope sees that this is wrong, and he excommunicates them. And then the Venetian leadership, or the people of the leadership of Venice, Italy, keeps their excommunication a secret. And then the Crusaders go and sack Constantinople in 1204, and two other Crusaders or Crusades strike Egypt. But this fails to weaken the Muslims, who are still very, very strong. The Children's Crusade, many people have heard about in 1212. There was actually more than one, but the traditional story has it that in 1212, thousands of children are sent on crusade, and they die or they're enslaved in a failed crusade. Some historians believe that that is probably largely a legend and a fictional account, that this probably never happened. Nonetheless, the story persists. So there are a couple stories here about the Children's Crusade. You can read about it on your own. finally, the Spanish Crusade is called the Reconquista, which is an attempt by the Christians to regain Spain, which had fallen to the Muslims. So most of Spain had been controlled by the Moors, who were Muslim during this time period, and the Catholic Church wanted um, to regain it back. So between roughly 1100 and 1492, you have the Spanish Inquisition, which was basically a court that was supposed to suppress heresy and expel non-Christians from Spain. And unfortunately, there are some really bad things that happen. They get rid of Jews. They start executing Jews. Even Jews who had converted to Christianity were held suspect, and certainly Muslims. And so you can read more about that if you're interested. And then finally, the effects of the Crusades on Europe were essentially that they demonstrate the power of the church because they convinced all those people to go out and fight, and most of those battles were lost. Women manage the home and business affairs while men are away, and so it actually helps increase the role of women a little bit. Merchants expand trade and bring back a lot of goods from Southwest Asia. And then the failure of the later Crusades actually weakens the Pope and the nobles, but strengthens the king. So society, many parts of society become more secularized. And the Crusades create a lasting bitterness between Muslims and Christians, between Eastern and Western churches, and also between Christians and Jews, which is not always mentioned in here. So it really lays the seeds of anti-Semitism or ill feelings towards the Jews, and this sort of lays the foundation for that. And so that's it for section 1, and we will move on to section 2 soon.